Good morning. That was a wonderful lead-in for panel number 2, which is on economic development. My name is Ann Wessells. I'm also on the Urban Studies faculty here at UW-Tacoma. I am a planning studies scholar, and most of my work is on urban governance, collaborative governance, institutional change, and much of my substantive work has been on urban waterfront. So as you can imagine, being here in Tacoma and in the Puget Sound is a great place to be. I'm going to take a moment to introduce our panelists on this second panel. We are very fortunate to be joined not only by 2 local civic leaders who are working in economic development, but also by an economist who's here with us from the Bay Area. I'm going to go in order, along the order of the way that our speakers are seated at the table in the front. Starting with John Barline, who is a real estate attorney here in Tacoma who works in real estate development, commercial land use development, and will be able to help us to understand the market in downtown Tacoma and the conditions of real estate development and construction here in Tacoma. John he's of counsel with Williams Kastner in their Tacoma office and works in their business and real estate transactions practice group. He is a frequent lecturer for continuing legal education and works with community groups. And he is also the chair of the Executive Council, which my students know as the leadership group of local corporate leaders who came together to help bring UW-Tacoma here to where we are sitting on this campus. The Executive Council continues to work to think about the issues impacting Tacoma's development, its future, and so we're delighted to have him joining us today. Moving to John's right, Dr. Cynthia Kroll is the chief economist for the Association of Bay Area Governments. So on the heels of our conversation about the importance of regional governance, and that this is not a conversation really about one or another city, but in fact a conversation about regions in their entirety. How do metropolitan regions think together, and what are the economic trends and dynamics that are influencing those choices? Dr. Kroll, for 20 years, was the director of the Fisher Center for Real Estate and Urban Economics at UC Berkeley. She is one of the rare scholars who has been able to bridge the worlds of academic research and governance practice. And so it will be wonderful to hear from her perspective some of the dynamics of the San Francisco Bay Area. Her research has spanned issues such as global restructuring, labor outsourcing, green technologies, and innovation. And so both through her presentation and through the Q&A that will follow, it will be wonderful to be able to gain the perspective of the Bay Area. And to Dr. Kroll's right, Bruce Kendall is the CEO of the Economic Development Board of Tacoma-Pierce County. He is also the former chair of the Washington Economic Development Council. And so Bruce, I think, will also be able to tell us about the local and regional context, not just from the perspective of the city of Tacoma, but in fact from the entire South Sound, broader statewide and regional Pierce County perspective. Also a very active civic leader, Bruce is on the board of the Central Puget Sound Economic Development District, the Tacoma Art Museum, the Tacoma-Pierce County Chamber of Commerce, the County Workforce Development Council, and the World Trade Center. So we are really fortunate to be joined by such established and thoughtful guests, and I am going to turn the podium over to John Barline.
Thank you very much, Ann. Visions, plans, and realities. Realities, I'll start with just a short one there. And if the reality is that if you look at a map, we in Tacoma are just as much on the edge as Portland is. In fact, my wife's mantra is, if you're not living on the edge, you're not really living. And I think that's a great one to remember when you're leading your life every day. I actually love Tacoma very, very much. I was born and raised here, went to school elsewhere, and came back because I love it so much. I called a good friend of mine on the phone yesterday and said, I told her about giving this presentation that happened to be Stephanie Stebish, the director of the Tacoma Art Museum, and I said, Stephanie, do you have a slide that permeates the love of Tacoma and what we're all about? Mount Rainier, the city, some of the museums, the housing, all the rest of it. And this is the slide that she sent. And I think it's an excellent slide. And of course, you'll see up front and foremost, Tacoma Art Museum right down here. Of course, that's where the slide came from. But the things that we have one of the greatest ports in the world. We have the LeMay, America's Car Museum, right up there in the far corner next to the freeway. We have the State History Museum, the barrel shapes right here, right next door to the Union Station, which was refurbished into the U.S. Federal Courthouse. The Museum of Glass, we can see the old wigwam shape, the history of the city of Tacoma. The wigwams being what were burning the slag from the old forest product days, the lumber mills down on the waterfront, and of course that wigwam shape happens to be the stack for the glass shop, the hot shop of the Glass Museum. Mount Rainier, the biggest draw of our state for tourism. Point Defiance, the city fathers planned our city quite well in establishing what a gem that we have there. Chambers Bay Golf Course, the home of the U.S. Open this spring. Fantastic event. But it's not just about golf. If you go out there almost any day of the week, in fact, I went out there to run around it last Sunday, and the place was jammed with people. You could hardly find a parking place. A fantastic asset. University of Washington, Tacoma. It's all about education. We've heard the speakers earlier today talk about education, and we're very proud to have UWT right here, along with Tacoma's school district's increased ratings nationally recently. Good things take time. A place is never done. Plans. As many of you know, I represent the Haub family. I actually work for them, and they are the owners and developers of the Columbia Bank Center and the Superblock downtown. So let me give you a little history on that. The Columbia Bank Center broke ground in August of 1999 and opened in early 2001. And unfortunately, it's the most recently built Class A large office building in Tacoma. It started this way. Back in 1985, 30 years ago, Eravon Haub was talked into buying the Greyhound block in downtown Tacoma by Bill Phillip. This is the Phillip Hall. So Mr. Haub bought that, but unfortunately Greyhound said, well, we'll sell it to you on the proviso and condition that we get a lease back for 10 years. So that sort of stymied that block for that period of time. But Bill's idea that he shared with Mr. Haub was, I would love to have you build me a headquarters building for Puget Sound National Bank in downtown Tacoma, our very own state-of-the-art new building. Well, time went by and the 10 years went by, and by the time the 10 years were over, Puget Sound National Bank was no more. It had been purchased by KeyBank. Bill Phillip and Melanie Dressel went out and started their own new bank in the garage, and it developed into what you see today. And he happened to come back in 1998 to Mr. Haub and said, you know, we talked about a new building a while back. Would you consider building one with the new bank's name on it, Columbia Bank Center? So Mr. Haub said, I will consider building a headquarters building for you if it will pencil, meaning if I, as the owner developer, can get a return on my investment. I'm not just going to throw money away. Well, that made perfect sense to Bill. And we said, how many floors of roughly a 20 to 25,000 square foot floor plate would you be willing to lease? And he said, well, I'll lease 3. And if you know much about real estate and borrowing to finance construction and all of this, now that might be 50 to 60% of what you can build. Well, then we could only build a 5 or a 6 story building. So that didn't quite hit home, was something we were going to think about. So Bill said to me, John, we've got to go around and see if we can get a good commercial broker to work with us and see if we can get some more tenants in this building so we can build something bigger. So we hired Mike Hickey of Neil Walter Company, and we started PRing this all around town. And finally, Bill said, well, we're not getting anybody that wants to pay the rent that's required for a new building. Let's you and I go talk to George Russell, the Russell Company. We had a private meeting with George, and his first response was, well, no, I am thinking about selling my company in the future, and this building that I own, I'm first going to do a long-term lease, and then I might sell the company. But unbeknownst to Bill, his head of real estate development and occupancy for the entire company, Mr. McDonald, said, we need more space. So he came to us and signed a 15-year lease for 3 full floors. So now we had 6 floors. That made the development of the Columbia Bank Center possible. We then sat down and we did a site study. We didn't just say we're going to build it on the Greyhound block. We said, where's the best place to build this in the city? And we looked around at the neighboring properties and we said, you know, if we could get at the old Puget Sound National Bank computer building, which is at 1301 A Street, right out on the edge. This isn't, you can't see it on this map. Let me see here. Here, you can see right in the center up there, that's on the kind of on the cliff going down to Dock Street, there's 1301 A Street. And the Haub property, the Greyhound, is over here along Pacific Avenue. And I think everybody knows where that is, but that's the Greyhound right there. That's the Columbia Bank Center. So we looked around and we said, if we can acquire this block, it would be better because we've got all the great views. In addition, the Haubs only owned the Greyhound block and didn't own the post office parking lot. And the goal, the long-term goal of the executive council, Mr. Haub, Bill Phillip, and the city at the time were to create this super block where some really fantastic development could be done in downtown. But the Postal Service wouldn't sell it to us. And we had been working to try to purchase that since 1985. By the way, we just bought it here a few years back, and I'll get to that in a moment. So we bought this other property from KeyBank and built the Columbia Bank Center. We were very lucky, and by the time we finished construction, we were 100% leased and have always been 100% leased. Fantastic comments and compliment to the city. So the Haubs started getting excited about Tacoma. And they said in 2006, remember we finished that in 2001, let's try another building in downtown Tacoma. Let's see if the market will bear it. And so they also owned the Oliver Taxi site, which is next door to where Sorrows used to be. And this was a rendering that BCRA did for us in 2006. We took this rendering out to the public. We published it in SEBA, on CoStar. Neil Walter had it on its website. We called on lots of companies in the area. We even directly worked with DaVita, but they didn't want to pay the higher rent that a new building requires. And we only got one legitimate inquiry for about 20,000 square feet, and then they actually went away. And it was a government entity that about 4 or 5 years later resurfaced and went into the Pacific Plaza building in Tacoma. Now I'll go back to this. In April of 2009, the Haubs were finally able to buy the post office parking lot. So that then created the super block. Well, you see my final slide of TAM. And that created this super block area, which is bifurcated right here by Court A. So it's the big super block right there. And they also own this, which is Oliver Taxi, where you just saw the rendering that we saw. Right about that very same time, in fact, about a month and a half later, Russell Company announced publicly that they were looking for a new headquarters. They were looking actively in Tacoma and Seattle. So the Haubs and the city of Tacoma worked very hard to try to keep the Russell Company here. In fact, I want to compliment the city and the Tacoma Partnership, which was primarily made up of the EDB. Bruce was kind of our fearless leader in that, the Executive Council, and others, for the very hard work that they did on that project. At that time, I met directly with the then CEO of the Russell Company, and they were extremely serious about wanting to stay in Tacoma. In fact, they partnered with us, and we put together a small team of people, which consisted of 2 Russell representatives, our representatives, Mike Hickey of Neil Walter Company, a well-known developer from Seattle that was a representative of Russell, LMN Architects, and Sullen Construction, and we met once a week, every Friday, for 1/2 to a full day. And by the way, Ellie Wakowiak was present at most of those meetings on behalf of the city of Tacoma to make sure that whatever we designed together for Russell would work relative to permitting and planning and zoning and all of this. We were successful in getting to the final 2, one location in Seattle, which was not divulged to us at the time, and this site. We made a great presentation, we thought, but on September 9th of 2009, 999, Russell announced that it chose to purchase the WAMU Tower in Seattle. I really can't blame them because there was no way we could beat the price that they paid for the WAMU Tower. At the time, you might remember, Washington Mutual had recently gone bankrupt. The building had been taken over by Morgan Chase. They didn't want the building anymore because it was pretty much empty. And so they sold it for roughly 1/3 of the original construction cost, and it had only been completed a couple of years prior. Well, as you probably all know, Russell has turned that again and made a huge profit off of it. So that was fantastic for them, unfortunate for Tacoma. Plans and realities. Pre-leasing, as I said before, is very important. Construction of a new building requires and depends upon market demands, the economy, the cost of construction, and the return on investment for the owner. Tacoma's problem today relative to not seeing more new buildings is we don't have a demand for Class A office space. We have a demand for housing. You see the Henry going up and Point Ruston, fantastic projects. We have a phenomenal demand for warehousing. That market has gone crazy. If you stand up on the hill above Tacoma and you look out at the port and the warehouses in the Puyallup Valley, et cetera, it's amazing out there. But we don't have a demand for office at the moment. Let me give you an example of the ROI economics. The Russell building itself was roughly a 250,000 square foot building with 5 stories of underground parking. The total all-in cost, that's shell and core and soft costs, the land, and the tenant improvements, came to $399 a square foot. And that was with a lot of tweaking to get that down. For the owner to get a 7% return on that, it would translate to a rental cost of $27.93 per square foot, plus the operating cost pass-through of roughly $10 a square foot. The operating pass-through cost is the cost of owning the building that we pass through to the tenant. That's light, water, HVAC, real estate taxes, insurance, and maintenance. So that means a total rental cost of $37.93 per square foot in order to get a 7% return. A little bit less to just plain break even. Tacoma's rents are at the highest right now, $29 a foot. In CBC, we're averaging about $25 a square foot, the highest in Tacoma. So we can't afford to build a new building if it's going to rent at 37 or 38. And by the way, those were 2009 costs. Recently, we ran some numbers with Sellon on another potential project, and it came out, and this was again something similar, but without underground parking, which is a huge delta, and the cost came out to $425 per square foot. Again, that's all in. That includes the soft costs and the hard costs and the TI benefit that you give to the first users and so forth. So for a 7% return on that, it would require a rent of $39.75. A tough situation that we're in. When demand goes up and rental rates go up in Tacoma, buildings will rise. So the Haubs haven't sat totally still. We've looked at this property that we have, the super block, and said, we have to be ready. We want to be ready in the event that we get a big user that comes to Tacoma and wants to develop. So we are ready. We've developed over 5 potential scenarios of how we could develop the super block. This happens to be one. It's a mixed use scenario. You can see here's retail along Pacific Avenue. It happens to be some cinema there. Actually, the cinema's in the pink along the side there. This is 3 stories of retail on the front of Pacific Avenue. More retail on the city-owned block, which is, I say, a quarter block, which is the Sorrows, assuming we might be able to work something with the city to build, to buy, say, air rights and build something there. And then you can see 2 office buildings on the Oliver Taxi and where the post office parking is. And the existing Columbia Bank Center is just behind the building on the left. That's one scenario. We've actually shopped this, and we're waiting for a user that wants to come to Tacoma that would like to have this. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about, just briefly about visions and the actions of the Tacoma Executive Council. The Tacoma Executive Council was formed back in the 80s by Bill Phillip, Bill Honeysett, News Tribune at the time, George Weyerhaeuser, George Russell, and Ervon Haub, and a few other city leaders back in those days. One of the first and biggest projects that they tackled was lobbying the Board of Regents in Seattle when the University of Washington wanted to establish branch campuses, and it was going to go out to TCC, and we said we really want and need it and think an urban campus would be fantastic for our city. So we not only lobbied Seattle, but lobbied in Olympia, and here is the result. A fantastic amenity to our community. Another project that we championed was the LeMay, America's Car Museum. Harold was quite the collector. He owned over 3,000 cars, was in the Guinness Book of Records for his collection, and we went out to Harold and said, what if we can get you the property for nothing? Would you consider building it downtown? And he said yes, and we entered into long negotiations with the city to do that, and there was actually a site selection committee that was led by Ray Corpus, Paul Miller, and Kevin Phelps, by the way, was on that, who is with the county right now. But again, it was a public site selection. I'm not commenting on co-location decision yesterday or the day before yesterday, but a public process of site selection that selected the site right next to the dome out there. And you can see the result. You saw it in the first slide. Pacific Avenue streetscapes was something that we championed, the use of the federal and state money to beautify the streetscapes here recently. Other projects that we've been involved in and that were championed by the Executive Council are the Glass Museum. And by the way, I should read you the mission of the Executive Council. Its purpose is to support the vitality of the central business district of the city of Tacoma by encouraging and promoting civic engagement, private and public sector partnerships, cultural and educational advancements, and economic development. The last project that they championed was the addition to the Tacoma Art Museum. And as you probably all know, the Haubs made a wonderful gift to our city and the Tacoma Art Museum. They paid for the new wing, and they gave them approximately 300 pieces of phenomenal Western art, and established an endowment for the Western art itself and for the employees down there. I love Tacoma. Is there a more beautiful place to live? Are there any nicer people in the world? I don't think so. Good things take time. A place is never done. Thank you.
Well, that was a wonderful picture of what can be and has been done in Tacoma. I want to thank the group for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to be up here and see a new place for me, and also a pleasure to be talking about economic development. I see economic development as the place where academics, government, the private business sector, and local community groups, interests, and advocates come together to really discuss what the city should look like, what's needed most, and how to reach there. And it is so satisfying when you end up with a process that works and an outcome that really brings what the community wants and needs. So this is one of my favorite aspects of my work. Now I have to figure out how to, oh, all right. Oh. I'm technology challenged, even though I come from the Bay Area. So I'm going to start with the context of what we're doing in the Bay Area and what's the institutional situation that we come from when we start talking about doing economic development at the regional level. We have the Bay Area region that the Association of Bay Area Governments covers has 9 counties, 101 cities. We have 109 jurisdictions altogether because one of our counties, San Francisco, is also a city. We have 4 regional governing bodies, in fact, our regional planning bodies in the Bay Area. We have the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, which is actually the metropolitan planning organization through which all transportation dollars are funneled. We have ABAG, which is a council of governments. In many places, the council of governments and the MPO are one and the same, but in our region they are not, and we have to work together. Then we have the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, which is responsible for planning and regulation of lands around the perimeter of the Bay. And we have the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, which is responsible for regulating emissions and the sources of those emissions. And we then all do our work. We are all in some way enabled or legislated by the state of California. And more we're being required to work together. There are 3 main pieces of legislation that affect what ABAG does today in a different way than when it was first established. One is the regional housing needs allocation. The state has a fair housing plan that requires communities to provide housing for a range of different population groups that live in their area or work in their area, and they give each region a housing number that region then has to allocate to their local jurisdictions. You can imagine how popular we are when we do that process. Some places want more than they can get, and some places want a lot less than they're required to get. We, of course, can't make them do anything other than encourage them to plan for it in their housing elements, but that is a very hot political issue. Then we also, through 2 separate bills, are required to do land use planning that takes into account how land use planning can affect greenhouse gas emissions. And we are required to do our land use planning in cooperation with MTC's regional transportation planning to produce together a sustainable community strategy. Our agency did that for the first time finishing in 2013, and we are now already embarking on the next one that will be done in 2017. And we do all that within resources and policies that come down from the federal level, which is then subject to politics as well in Congress. So that's the context in which we're trying to do regional planning. Many local jurisdictions, working with 3 other regional agencies, and then under state and federal mandates and funding. Here's the geographic context in 30 seconds. We're a region of about 7.5 million people, about twice the size of the Seattle-Tacoma region. Our jobs have been growing since 2010 at more than twice the rate of our population, which has been growing at more than twice the rate of housing. And that's pretty typical for the Bay Area, that housing development really lags our demand that comes from population and job growth. We see ourselves as a strong region economically, and we certainly are a region that is growing faster than both the nation and the state right now. Unfortunately, we also in the last 2 downturns have been a region that outpaced the state and nation on the way down. But nevertheless, we see ourselves as very resilient, that we have an economy that doesn't go into a long-term downward slide, but regenerates itself after every downturn that we have. However, it is an economy that has a lot of inequities in it. It really shows up when you look at the kinds of jobs that are growing. We've had very strong growth, even during the recession, in the high-wage occupations. And even during the recession, wages were growing in high-wage occupations, although that's partly because they were sloughing off the low-wage part of them. In contrast, we lost a lot of middle-wage jobs in the recession, and while that has turned around, middle-wage jobs are not growing as fast as either low-wage jobs or high-wage jobs. And on top of that, in terms of wages, when you look at it in adjusting for inflation, wages are dropping in middle and low-wage jobs, whereas in high-wage jobs, they're staying about the same in current dollars, dropping a little bit, adjusting for inflation. So we have very different effects on different parts of the population as we expand. Oops, and I missed the one on housing. The Bay Area has housing prices that are well above twice the national average and growing in general very strongly, very quickly until this latest housing bubble and downturn. You could really count on housing prices to stay pretty stable. Even in a downturn, they might go down a little bit, level off for a while, then they would start going up again. That's not what happened in this last downturn. We did have housing prices go up well above what they could be sustainable at, but at the high end of the market, those housing prices have already been recovered, partly because they didn't go up as high as other types of product. At the low end of the market, prices went up much faster than the rest of the market and down much more than the rest of the market and have not recovered. Now that is good news for future home buyers. It hasn't been good news for the people who were in those homes and bought them at the peak, many of whom have been displaced and are now actually on the rental market where rents have been steadily rising. So those are the challenges we have region-wide. Within the region, as you can imagine, the challenges are pretty diverse. So we have counties within the region that have almost 2 million people and almost 1 million jobs. That's Santa Clara County, the home of Silicon Valley. And we have tiny counties that have about 100 million people and less than 100 million jobs, as with Napa County. The whole North Bay area has about as many people as Alameda County, which is one part of what we call the East Bay. In terms of industries, these vary a great deal as well. This is my one academic planning lesson for those of you who aren't students or faculty members out there. A location quotient is a number that compares the share of jobs in an industry in the county with the share of jobs in the industry in the nation. So that for Napa County, for example, that green bar is almost at the 8 level, and it shows that Napa has 8 times its expected level of agricultural jobs. So just look at the colors. The green shows agricultural, which is concentrated in the North Bay. So we have some very agricultural counties. The red and brown show the professional and technical and information jobs, which are concentrated most heavily in the South Bay, Santa Clara and San Mateo County. But you can see other parts of the region, in the middle part of the region, have also been benefiting from that concentration, San Francisco in particular. And then you have manufacturing, which still happens in this very expensive region. In the North Bay, it's beverage manufacturing, wine, and in the South Bay and parts Alameda County, which is in the east, it's tech-related manufacturing. I couldn't fit them all on one slide. This slide also shows some of the tourism base, the accommodations, and the arts and recreation, which are mainly in the North Bay, but also, of course, in San Francisco. And then the other thing is that where you have the people concentrated more than the jobs concentrated, you also have higher concentrations of jobs like healthcare and retail. So very different types of job possibilities in different parts of the region. And because the mix of occupations and industries are different in different parts of the region, the job growth experience has been very different historically. So you can see Silicon Valley, for example, which is mainly Santa Clara County, that the top line, because it has the most jobs, has, you can see 2 peaks there. The first one is the dot-com boom, and the second one is the housing boom. And Silicon Valley recovered very quickly from the housing boom, and we're well above the job level that it reached during that boom, but it has not yet recovered in this set of data, but it will have by now recovered the jobs that were lost from the dot-com boom. So that was 2000. That's 14 years, 15 years. San Francisco and Napa County are the only 2 counties that have recovered from both of those booms and that have job levels higher than in both 2000 and 2007. And some of the North Bay counties are still, and Contra Costa County are still struggling to recover jobs from both of those booms. So with different job levels, different job growth trajectories, we also have very different unemployment levels, although these unemployment numbers that you see here overall, region-wide, look much, much better than they looked in 2009, when they were hovering around the 9-10% point, and even around the 7, 8, 9 point for those counties that are now below 4%, Marin, San Mateo, and San Francisco. We do have Solano County, which is up at 6%, higher than ideal, but well below what we see in California. Nevertheless, we have places where unemployment is much higher. The cities on the right are the places that are where unemployment is above 10%, and those are a mix of cities that are in more or less rural areas like American Canyon. Gilroy is primarily an agricultural area. Cities that are older industrial places, Pittsburgh, El Cerrito, San Pablo, and cities that have a concentration of distressed populations. East Palo Alto, Oakland has a double whammy of both the old industry and the distressed populations. So we have individual cities that are looking at very different types of problems than someplace like Silicon Valley, where you can't even get a business person to talk to you about economic development because they're too busy managing their growth. So how do you set an economic development path for the region within this very diverse region with very different needs at different levels? So you end up with some really big goals. And a lot of the conversation about economic development at the regional level centers around the conversation about sustainability. And we like to say sustainability involves 3 E's. It's not just the environment, it's also the economy, and it's also equity. So we want, in terms of the economy, we need to support existing industry, nurture new business endeavors, employ an increasingly diverse labor force, and provide living wages, which then feeds into the equity issue of providing people with access to opportunity, ways to actually earn those living wages, and also access to affordable housing so that they don't spend all of their wages on housing prices. How do you reach that at a regional level? Well, we really are doing it in very incremental steps. So we have these really big goals, but the power to do it comes from individual businesses, it comes from at the city level in terms of how they use their land, it comes from organizations like our workforce investment boards, which may be a county level or a 2-county operation, it comes from interest groups that might represent one small population group or business group, like we have several different ethnic, really immigrant-related business organizations in Silicon Valley around Indian engineers, the Chinese engineers, the Hispanic retail organizations, and so forth. So each of those has their role to play, and of course the chambers of commerce. And all of these happen often at the local level, but then there are some county or regional level groups as well. So in trying to encourage cooperation at a regional level, one of our goals is to take all of those resources and build from those existing resources, but also to build new capacity. So this slide is just shots of different websites of different resources. At the top you have the more city and county level, everywhere from San Francisco and Berkeley to East Palo Alto have their own economic development site for their city. Solano County has an economic development corporation that draws in all of its cities. You have organizations that are primarily business oriented and around a certain part of the region, so joint venture Silicon Valley built up really from the American Electronics Association trying to pull the tech businesses together, but has expanded greatly. And the East Bay Leadership Council is businesses in Alameda and Contra Costa County, really a wider swath of traditional businesses, everything from Chevron to some of the banks belong to that, as well as smaller businesses. You have organizations that built up around a specific geography, and developing that geography, the Grand Boulevard Initiative, which I'll say a little bit more about later if I don't get, I'm at 0 already. We won't talk about that right now. I do want to say a few words about the Bay Area Council Economic Institute, which is an organization that's about 25 years old now, and it's from its initial form, and it was formed by the Bay Area Council, which is a regional business organization in cooperation with ABAG and with the major universities, Berkeley, Stanford, and the California State Universities. So I have to say a few words about then how do you engage new actors? Well, we were fortunate enough to get one of those HUD grants that was mentioned this morning that offered $5 million to do economic prosperity planning, much of which went into pilot projects. And we divided that into housing, equity, and economic prosperity. And we're able to bring in groups that did research on what might be the most effective programs, and then actually try out different pilot projects. And this was very effective in bringing many people to the table who had been working in their own little areas of expertise in their communities, talking together about how to best develop opportunity within the region. We think economic development fits really well with ABAG's other major responsibilities, and I'm just going to close with talking about some of the initiatives that we think are important to continue pursuing at the regional level. we're focusing some of our technical assistance, trying to draw communities together around transportation corridors. The Grand Boulevard corridor was really an example that that we are following now in 2 East Bay areas. And we're working with communities to try and build job opportunities and try to find ways of strengthening middle-income jobs and improving low-income jobs. We are working with the whole goods movement area in cooperation with the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and the businesses involved with that. We are trying to strengthen our business partnerships. As I mentioned, they're so busy they don't even want to talk about this anymore, but they really do care about what happens in that regional land use plan. So we need to find a way to bring them to the table to talk about where development should go. And another issue that really was raised as a concern is that the opportunities for employment, for moving people into middle wage jobs, is going to come largely from retirements of people who are in the baby boom generation who are going to be leaving those jobs, and how do you prepare the newer generations for those jobs. And finally, we talk about housing. So we face a lot of challenges, political in terms of resources, and really in providing continuity. Once you have this wonderful set of pilot projects and you've engaged all these people, how do you keep them engaged and talking together? Thank you for your time.
As mentioned, I'm Bruce Kendall with the Economic Development Board for Tacoma Pierce County, and I know I don't need to tell this group that you are sitting in the middle of one of the great economic engines of this economy. A quick story, when Bill Gates was in high school, his father was a very prominent attorney in Seattle, still is to this day, and was able to gain access to the UW Seattle computer labs for his son, who was still in high school. He actually had a pass key to get himself in to those rooms. You could make the argument, and I will make the argument, that no University of Washington, there is no Microsoft, at least in this state. There's no particular reason for Microsoft to be located in the state of Washington. It's here because Bill Gates grew up here and has an affection for the area. But you can go back even further than that. Bill Boeing worked with the physics lab at the University of Washington when he was transitioning from being a wooden boat builder to a wooden airplane builder, and did some early flight testing with some of the professors at the university, flight plan testing with some of the university professors. If there's no Boeing, you could argue that there may not have been a reason for Bill Gates Sr. and his family to ever locate in this area, hence no Bill Gates here. Without Boeing and Microsoft, there's no way Jeff Bezos starts Amazon with the great vision that he had starting in a garage in the 1990s. He had to choose a part of the country where there was a great educational research institution that was going to produce the employees he needed to hire in the future. Now, of course, he hires all over the country, but you need to be, the engines of our economy are driven in this day and age to a large extent by our research universities. So it is always a thrill to be on this campus and talking about opportunities in economic development, and why I often, those of you who have heard me talk before, talk about Tacoma Pierce County as the region of boom. Some haven't heard the boom yet, but and some of the earlier speakers mentioned this. It's happening. Sometimes when you're in the middle of the explosion, you're not completely aware of what's going on. In this case, I believe that is the situation that we find ourselves in. My organization's work is around, it's very granular in many respects. It's about recruiting great companies into this market, and also working with existing companies to help them make the decision to stay and grow here. We work with primary firms, and we define primary firms as those that are making a product or service in this market, and I'll define this market for now as Pierce County. And yes, they'll have clients and customers inside the county, but they're largely exporting product and services outside this market. That's how you bring new dollars into the market. And our vision behind this, why we do this and why we focus on this in particular, is that those are, generally speaking, higher wage jobs with greater career opportunities within those fields represented by those companies. And what we're really all about is creating job and career opportunities for the citizens who either grew up here or moved here yesterday and want to make this their home. The more career job opportunities you have for folks, the more likely it is they're going to stick, stay, start families, become leaders in the community, attend the University of Washington, Tacoma, and other institutions as well. So that's why we do what we do. That's our vision. The more opportunity for the citizens we can provide in terms of jobs and careers, we try to do that. The plans we have for doing that are focused around these primary businesses, both recruiting and retaining. We will look at any opportunity, and this is classic economic development stuff. If it flies by, we'll take a look at it. If it flies by, we'll take a look at it. A great example of that is State Farm. There was no committee that sat around saying, let's go after State Farm. Now, maybe there should have been a committee that did that, but ultimately, State Farm now has 1,300 employees in downtown Tacoma, filling the former Russell building, as John mentioned earlier. You have to be ready when those opportunities come. You have to be ready when those opportunities come, and you have the space available for them. The city of Tacoma worked tirelessly, the property owner worked tirelessly, the leasing company worked tirelessly to make that happen. And so you have to always be ready for that. But you also have to, and this is the other part of our work, you also have to focus, because you can't be all things to all people. So we focus on certain key clusters, and we have cluster acceleration teams that some of you were involved with that focus on longer term plays within certain sectors or clusters. And I'll just mention these, and if in the Q&A we want to go back and dig into some of the activities going on in each one of these, I'd be happy to do that. Aerospace and advanced manufacturing. Washington State is the center of the commercial aerospace industry in the world. It's actually a duopoly. There are two places, Toulouse, France, where Airbus is headquartered, and Puget Sound. Nowhere else comes close. Now, there's some fast followers out there, other countries trying to develop aircraft, but we are still the dominant player, along with Airbus, in this global marketplace. If we didn't have this, it would be impossible, I would argue, to invent it. I mean, we have inherited this, and it's part of our legacy, so part of our job is to make sure that that industry remains as successful as it can be. And this gets to a broader definition of region, because as various people have talked, you've heard people talk about, well, the region is Puget Sound, oh no, the region's Pierce County. It's both of those things. But if you start with the region from Everett to Frederickson, through Tacoma to Frederickson, Washington, and look at it from one industry's perspective, and this is kind of one of the lenses we look at the world through, the aerospace industry looks at the geography of Everett to Frederickson as its shop floor. It is the shop floor for the greatest exporter in the history of capitalism, and that's Boeing. They've exported more value around the world in their history than any other company in history. In Frederickson, which is 13 miles from here, south of here, in unincorporated Pierce County, Boeing makes the tail of the 787. So the next time, if you haven't been on a 787 yet, you will at some point, because they're very popular and more are being purchased all the time. Know that airplane is staying in the air in part because of a product that's built right here in Pierce County, and that product is built by 1,800 highly paid, highly technologically sophisticated, highly educated employees at the Frederickson plant here in Pierce County. Well, they've got to get that empennage, the entire apparatus, from Frederickson to Everett for final assembly, because that's where final assembly takes place. So the region, in this respect, includes that transportation system. So at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, so this will be Monday night into Tuesday morning, go out on I-5, go out on 167, be careful, and you'll see the freeway closed, so they can drive these tails, of the 787 up the freeways to Everett for assembly. That's when the traffic is not nearly the problem it is many of the other hours of the day. So that's a regional perspective from one industry, but there's also, of course, right here in Pierce County, and our job is to, within these various clusters, to establish the biggest footprint we possibly can within that industry, within that cluster, so that we have jobs and career opportunities for the people who live here now. But because, and Dr. Medeiros had the very compelling information in his opening remarks, this cadre of workers that leave Pierce County every day, from an economic development perspective, we see that as a great advantage for our economic future, because they've already chosen to live here. And anybody who's moved, either within a region or from one region to another, knows can be the most exciting thing you ever do, and sometimes it's the most painful thing you might ever do, particularly if you have a family. So folks who live in a certain area tend to want to stay there if they can, and they tend to want to work closer to where they live than further away. So I'd rather be us than a community that's importing workers every day, particularly in a geographically constrained region like we have, because we have the opportunity to recruit companies in that are going to steal those employees. And that's another thing we do really well in economic development, is you want to create a system where, and stealing is good in this regard, where companies are stealing. You see it in Silicon Valley every single day. It's accepted as part of the industry and their economy. You want labor mobility, professional mobility within your region, and the closer we can bring these companies to where the workers are, which is here, the more opportunity we're going to have to land them. And companies, when we talk to them coming in from outside the state, they love to hear that we've got all these folks getting in cars and a few on trains and a few on buses every day and leaving, because they think they can snag those folks. So aerospace, health services, we can talk in detail about that. There's some great things being done by the university around health services. Franciscan, Multicare, and Madigan, huge economic engines unto themselves. There's some work being done right now to combine some of their work together. Logistics and international trade. In spite of what's going on at the port right now, we have the fourth largest gateway, Tacoma and Seattle combined, in the United States. And eventually this issue will get resolved. Knock on wood, and that will remain the case. You've heard about the alliance the two ports have agreed. Earlier, some speakers talked about political leadership, political courage, great courage going on there. That's an economic engine for us as well. Clean water technology, what's going on at the Center for Urban Waters, and some things that the city of Tacoma and Pierce County and others are doing on the government side there's some huge innovations going on around clean water technology that we think we might someday be able to sell around the world and attract companies into this market because of that. And then fifth, cybersecurity and information assurance. There's some really interesting opportunities there. It's not a big footprint for us right now. It's not really a big footprint anywhere. It's an emerging industry, and we think we have an opportunity to grow that in this market. So we have plans around all those things. The stuff flying by, and then specifically within some of these clusters. The reality, so vision, plans, and the reality. On the positive side, some amazing companies emerging in this market. I'll just mention one. IID used to be called Internet Identity, about 85 employees just down the block here on Broadway in the cyber space, information assurance space, hiring students out of the Institute of Technology at UWT and other places, attracting talent from all over. A real opportunity to be a great company down the road. There are others out there as well. We've got some household names that, though not as big as Boeing, are very important to our economic health and are growing in this marketplace. The Milgards, The GKN Aerospace, which is a brand new aerospace company that's just announced they're moving into Sumner, Washington. They will make the winglets that go on the wings of the 737 Maxes, which is the next airplane innovation coming out of Boeing. James Hardie Building Products, Toray Composites America, a Japanese company, Sierra Pacific, State Farm I mentioned earlier. So there's some rather substantial growing companies in our marketplace across different sectors. So some are white collar, some are blue collar, some are distribution, some are manufacturing. We are diverse enough that we need all of those and work with all of them. So that's some good things going on there on the positive side. Some of our challenges, John mentioned Class A office space. When the Russell building was available, when they left, there were 3 companies lined up trying to get into that space. So if you have the space, and you don't have to build it for the rates John was talking about, the demand is there. So our challenge as a community is to how do we get a building built profitably for the building owner so that we can meet the demand in the market, because our doors are being knocked on by companies. People aren't avoiding downtown Tacoma. I'm thinking of downtown Tacoma now. People aren't avoiding downtown Tacoma. What they're saying is, I need to move in 18 months at minimum, or maybe 12 months would be better, and here's what I can pay. So the demand is there. It's how we get to that. We have to work through the chicken and the egg issue. So that's a challenge that we have right there that's been mentioned earlier. Our transportation network. The state's got to pass this transportation package. It looks like we're getting some headway on this. Talk to your legislators. Do whatever you can, because even if we get all the companies we want to move into Pierce County, we're still part of this regional network, and we have to have a robust transportation system, and that includes buses as well as highways, and light rail is a piece of that too, if you've read the Sound Transit elements of what's being proposed. Our industrial land base, we're running out of space because we're so land constrained. And so that's an interesting topic for us to discuss maybe down the road. And then finally, investment in higher education. And K through 12 certainly, but higher education, we cannot abandon our universities. I know I'm preaching to the choir, or at least preaching to the provost and the deans and the professors and the adjunct professors and the members of the advisory boards, but we have to stay vigilant on that, because this is indeed one of our great economic engines, and will continue to do so. This campus, I learned this the other day, is growing at 8% a year. The national average is 1% a year. So think about an economy growing at 8%. This campus is growing at 8% a year, and that we want to sustain. So I'll leave it at that. I'm happy to answer questions with the rest of the panel as we proceed. Thank you.
Thanks. So a lot of fodder for thought and some good questions. I'm going to take one moment and just wrap up by trying to tie some of the points that were made together. I think John Barline did a wonderful job of helping us to understand why we don't see more construction downtown, and Bruce Kendall just referred to that the cost to construct new Class A office space far outpaces the current rental rate that you can demand for those spaces, leaving the city and its private leadership in a bit of a conundrum. But I also want to point out that he's talking about the leadership of the Executive Council and their investments and activity in what I think Ann Marcuson would call creating stickiness in Tacoma. She talks about industrial stickiness. This is an economic geographer and a planning scholar, but also cultural stickiness. And so trying to create the sorts of institutions that help to raise the demand, which seems to be part of what's going on here. Bruce Kendall is reminding us that it's not just real estate construction, economic development, but in fact we're talking about different sectors, and we're talking about the aerospace industry, we're talking about healthcare services, we're talking potentially about clean water technology. So what are those sectors, and how do we kind of signal that yes, Tacoma is here, we are ready to receive these investments and to grow our economy? I want to finish up though before asking for your questions by pointing out and reminding us of a few of the really important questions that Cynthia Kroll posed in her presentation. And in fact, they dovetail with thoughts that were coming to my mind in listening to the first panel around the issue of diversity and inequality. These tensions exist in our region, they exist in individual cities. I think that Dr. Kroll's pointing out of the disparity in different sectors of wage growth between high wage growth and more low wage sectors where is unemployment experienced? How do we come together to work together for a quote-unquote sustainable city and region if we are only focused on these macro measures of economic growth and environmental restoration without simultaneously asking ourselves questions around social equity and access to opportunity. So I wanted to just remind us of that very powerful representation of the Bay Area, where indeed these questions are extreme in terms of inequality and access to opportunity. And with that, I want to open the floor up to your questions for our wonderful panelists. Maybe I'll get us started by asking each of you if you wouldn't mind speaking to that issue of how communities can work together if, on the one hand, we're trying to grow economic activity and jobs and employment, whilst simultaneously addressing the fact that some cities have, as Dr. Kroll put it, more intensely distressed communities than others. And so how do we invest resources in attracting companies while simultaneously acknowledging at the least, or potentially investing in a more ambitious way, the needs of existing communities that are in cities such as Tacoma or other cities in the Bay Area?
Well, you have to do both, and so we, when we talk to companies from China or Japan, and we have some deep Japanese investment in this marketplace, as well as European firms, that they, if you're an international market, it means you're a diverse market, and that includes, who's at the meetings, who's at the table, and so it's incumbent for us on the economic development side, if we're going to be successful long term, we have to engage across diverse communities, and we don't do that as well as we could. We partner with a lot of organizations that reach out to those zip codes, as was mentioned earlier. But it's a competitiveness issue, is the way I would put it. So I guess what I'm doing is I'm agreeing with the premise of your question. We don't have a program around that ourselves, but I agree with you. It has to be part of what we think about.
I would agree with those points. I guess something I've really learned in the course of my career is that it's really important to build from what you have and to use those strengths to try and spread to the other needier parts of the region. So finding ways to provide job training for local disadvantaged residents to move into the industries that are either the most stable, the better paying, the growth sectors and that really involves bringing in all of these different local groups that do job training, that do business development, making sure that the training programs meet the needs of the employers, finding out what the employers need from an employee, and if the workforce you're trying to train doesn't have those skills, making sure that your training program addresses perhaps personal habits of coming to work on time, as well as language skills, as well as the actual technical skills that are needed. I think another thing is that I think the Bay Area really turns diversity into an asset. You mentioned the global nature of the economy. That's certainly true in our Bay Area economy. Many of our more distressed residents are immigrants, but they bring with them a lot of knowledge of cultures in different parts of the world, a lot of language skills that if they can also get over or build better strength at communicating and other business skills, make it a really powerful region.
Of course, I agree with all of those things. I think one of the greatest equalizers or ways that we can get the equalization is through education. And if we look at the city of Tacoma, at least our schools in the city of Tacoma, in the past we have not done a phenomenal job with that. until recently, and that was one of the early things that happened in Tacoma relative to that was Bob Craves came down here with the College Success Foundation and started working with as low down as the junior highs and in the high schools to get more success relative to that, and a lot of money has gone into the College Success Foundation through the Gates Foundation, through Costco and others. Extremely successful program. And they didn't focus on Tacoma for no reason at all. It was because we weren't doing well. Another positive there is Graduate Tacoma. And it shows some of the successes with the recent grades that we got nationally. University of Washington Tacoma and its impact on our community, as Bruce opened up, is unmeasurable. And under Deborah's leadership, the tremendous partnership that the UOWT established with JBLM in training the military people that were soon to get out in various sectors, job sectors that so they could get employment. Cybersecurity, for example, is one of those. And SOTA that we have here in Tacoma is very successful. So I think education is a great equalizer, and if we get a good educational program and get known for fantastic schools in Tacoma, sort of like Kerry Bozeman was talking about, Bellevue, now we're at and above the national average, and if we can keep going, it will be phenomenal.
And a question from the audience.
Yeah, so Mr. Barline, you had talked about the fact that the demand that we're experiencing downtown for Class A office space is relatively low, and that you had known that the demand that we're seeing is mostly for housing. You mentioned warehouses and other things like that. But you said that you were kind of just waiting for that demand to be there, and that when that demand showed up, you would be ready to develop. So given that we know where the demand actually is, how do we gain the mobility to be able to not wait for Class A to come and kind of capitalize on exploiting the demand that we know is already there?
Well, the demand that we know that is the warehouse demand, and that is being exploited. And if you look in the valley, it is being built out tremendously. We've seen the Van Leer farm recently converted into, or going to be converted into, potentially warehouse space, and other farms in the Puyallup Valley. You just see what's happened out there. Very unfortunate. If you were a farmer, if you own a warehouse or built a warehouse, those are selling for now at 5% caps, 5 caps. That's just unheard of. But it's amazing, and that's a result of the international trade that we're getting through the port of Tacoma and so forth. Housing is starting to come back, as I pointed out, relative to the Henry and what's going on in a few other locations in Tacoma. You will see demand in Class A office grow when you see the rents grow up. When I can ask and get $35 or $45 a square foot in rent, then I can afford to build the building. But when we had the empty Russell building as an example, and it filled up, and Bruce said there were 3 businesses there knocking on the door, they weren't willing to pay $40 a square foot. They were willing to pay $15 to $25 a square foot. We have plenty of B class space in Tacoma, and they can go there, or they can get into A space right now for that range. Some of the other market problems that we have here is what happened when the dot-com boom busted, and Federal Way was left with a lot of relatively inexpensive concrete tilt-up office buildings. Combine that with Weyerhaeuser downsizing. We saw DaVita. I told you that we presented DaVita an opportunity to come into a nice building in Tacoma. But DaVita moved its local headquarters up to Federal Way and purchased a building at a very low rate from Weyerhaeuser. So Weyerhaeuser now exiting Federal Way also has an impact on Tacoma and office space in Tacoma and so forth. We don't know what's going to happen with that warehouse campus up there, but in Federal Way they were getting $12 to $15 a square foot rents. So it's very difficult for Tacoma to compete when you've got that kind of a rent. If I had to rent the building out, that Columbia Bank Center out at $12 to $15 a square foot in rent, we would be in violation of our loan covenants with the bank, and the bank would take the building back.
So if you don't mind me following up, do you
Sure.
think it's a matter of shoring up the demand on in those other markets, or are we just waiting for time? Because it kind of seems like we're not in a position to be competitive, and it might be kind of inappropriate.
We are out knocking on the doors of businesses in Seattle all the time and asking them if they would like to move down to Tacoma and pay a little bit lower rent and have their residences, their employees live right here. Bruce has made plenty of contacts up there. We do it all the time. Unfortunately, they would rather be up in South Lake Union or in Seattle. Take a look at one of the reasons that Russell moved. It wasn't just because they got a great deal on a building up there, but they wanted an address that said Seattle because they're an international company. When Pacific First Federal was merged with Royal Trust of Canada, in that merger they said, you are moving to Seattle. And they built a building in downtown Seattle, the Pacific First Center up there, because they wanted a Seattle address. That's unfortunate. We are a second city. Not unlike Portland, I think we have to accept that and say, let's be the best Tacoma can be. I hope I tried to answer your questions. So.
Are there other questions? Or any other responses?
Bruce might want to talk about that.
I want to, do you have a question?
Yeah, and she does too. So we have a couple. So I'm interested in economic models that aren't based on growth and exploitation, especially because we live in a limited planet and finite resources. So I'm specifically thinking of like how we could think of our land bases differently than just filling up warehouses. And I think of the model put forth in the book, The Town That Food Saved, which is about actually a town living within its means and figuring out different ways of having businesses that actually support the sustainability of the region. So have you guys thought about economic models that are not based on growth?
Well, whether you're, the limit of sustainability is not no growth. Sustainability requires growth. I think what I would ask myself is, how one defines that. Certainly, we're very fortunate to live in an area where there is a very deep environmental ethic and a sustainability ethic. And that ethic doesn't just stop at small companies. If you're a successful large company, particularly selling internationally now, you will lose customers if you don't have a published and followed and measured sustainability policy, whether that's on your inputs or your outputs. So I think that every region that wants to be competitive needs to embrace what I would say most companies that are successful in this market have already embraced. We do have growth management limitations about where growth can happen, and I think there was an excellent discussion of that earlier. And that is very important to us because when we're talking, particularly, I'll use China as an example, there's a lot of capital fleeing China right now, in part because the owners of that capital want to live in a healthier natural environment than what they're experiencing in China. That's an advantage of ours, and we don't want to lose that advantage. So it's incumbent on us to make sure that we have a balance with respect to how we're using our land base and also the kinds of companies that we recruit into this market. We try to focus on companies that employ many people per square foot, if you will, as opposed to fewer. So we don't go after server farms. There are other parts of the country that in order for anybody in this room that has an iPhone or the equivalent is dependent upon a server farm, generally speaking, in a rural area with low electricity rates, but very few employees. Big capital investment, but very few employees. That might be right for them. For us, because we're land constrained, and our goal is to provide the students that are going to this university and the students that are in the K-12 system and people who might want to move here with the best job opportunities possible, because quality of life starts with a job in this market. Then we're not pursuing those sorts of land-intensive but employee-intensive types of businesses. So it's always a balance.
My question is about taking the Pierce County consolidation into consideration that just was passed and looking at 35th and Pacific. So my area of influence or interest is more in the areas that outlie outside of the downtown core. So how are some models or some things to be done to try to get as much benefit to the South Pacific and then our Lincoln Business District, kind of the surrounding neighborhood commercial corridors and mixed-use centers, when there is a project like that, even though it isn't necessarily a new business, but it's consolidating a campus approach and a major employment center at our gateways to some neighborhoods. What are some strategies you would think we should be looking at?
May have to ask David Bowe to answer that question, someone who's more attuned with that particular project. I'll say two things. Healthy economies in a community that's the age that we are. We weren't started yesterday. This is a community that's had 100 and more years of development, and has a center city that's identifiable with great historic architecture and new architecture and infrastructure in place. It's hard to find a region that has a place like that that's healthy economically if the downtown core isn't economically healthy. So, and that's never about a project, it's about a series of projects and the infrastructure that and the commitment that goes with that. So I think there'll always be a conversation about what sometimes is called the 50-yard line in Pierce County, which is somewhere between 11th and Pacific and where we're sitting right now, 21st and Pacific. You know, it's a pretty safe bet that that's the center of the urban part of Pierce County, and it's important to have the amenities one expects to find in urban centers: finance, insurance, real estate, medical services. That's not to say they don't exist other places, but I haven't seen a model yet that where there's the donut hole is not operating well, and all the amenities happen in the surrounding areas. Having said that, one of our great strengths, and we get this from companies we tour through who've never been in the state of Washington before in their lives. So the first look they have at the state of Washington is Tacoma, Pierce County, and beyond. They love the vibrant neighborhoods that we're able to show them. We'd like to show them more. And so we need a strategy for those neighborhoods that don't have the vibrancy that you might find in certain parts of Tacoma in particular. What's the strategy? That our bandwidth is only so wide, so we're not engaged in a strategy around community business districts, but they are. We sell to those, though. They're very important to us. So if we have a good one, that's the one we show companies when we're talking about quality of life issues. That probably partially answers your question.
I think you have a great opportunity up in the Lincoln District now, obviously with $130 million being invested, but that money is all being invested in that facility, and you're going to be having, according to the county's statistics, at least 1,000 visitors a day to the facility coming into use, coming and going. They're not staying all day, they're coming in and out. So that's quite a bit of traffic on the street. It's probably not people on foot, but it's people in cars. So there'll be a huge impact. And there hasn't been a whole lot of study on the streets, and the lights and the access and the transportation up there, because the county had, that property was already zoned commercial because it was a hospital in the past. So they were able to get in there and do that. So now I believe it's incumbent upon the community, the Lincoln District community, to put pressure on the county itself and on the city to help you plan what's going to happen around that facility so that it will come off as being a huge success for all of you. And when we were asking those questions to the city, or the county rather, they hadn't gone beyond their own facility. So, but I did hear some of you from the community talking about how you're getting together and starting to work towards that. I believe that the Proctor district is a very successful district. It doesn't have a $130 million project in it, but has been able to reinvent itself quite successfully. 6th Avenue has done the same thing. UP is starting to do that, and I think the Lincoln District's right on the cusp of being able to do that. But that's why I think your group needs to coalesce and go put pressure on the county that's causing this and work with it along with the city on development of your own plans up there.
I think we are going to wrap it up and go move towards lunch, but I do want to make one final comment before we do so, which is to pick up on the notion of sustainability once again, because I want to mention to our panelists as well as to the assembled guests here something that the sustainability director here in the city of Tacoma mentioned to me recently about the energy profile that we enjoy in the city of Tacoma and our relative reliance on hydropower. And in thinking about sustainability, I know that our final panel is going to take on the issue of housing, and the other thing that I learned from our sustainability director is that we do not, in fact, have as much affordable housing as we tend to self-story or narrate. So it'll be very interesting to hear after lunch about the actual housing profile that we have. But I also wonder about energy and clean water technology as being something that we can explore more over lunch in the future. Thank you very much for a wonderful panel too. Please join me in thanking our panelists.